Life in the small town of Riverdale was about to change forever on that chilly autumn evening. The town's newly elected mayor was wrapping up another exhausting day at City Hall. Being the first black mayor in the town's 127-year history meant every decision, every meeting, and every public appearance carried extra weight. The day had been particularly draining. First, there was the morning press conference about the new community center project. Then came the heated debate over budget allocations for public schools. By the time the final budget meeting ended, the clock had already struck 11:30 p.m. The mayor gathered his belongings, a worn leather briefcase filled with proposal drafts and a half-empty coffee tumbler that had been his faithful companion throughout the day. The cleaning staff had already left, their footsteps long silent in the empty hallways. Only the gentle hum of the building's heating system kept him company as he made his way to the parking lot. The crisp night air felt refreshing against his face as he walked to his car. The black Mercedes, a gift from his late father, stood alone under the flickering parking lot lights. His dad had always believed in dressing for the job you want, not the one you have. "Son," he used to say, "carry yourself with dignity, and the world will have no choice but to recognize it." Those words echoed in his mind as he settled into the driver's seat. The streets were quiet at this hour. Riverdale, with its population of 50,000, wasn't exactly known for its nightlife. Streetlights cast long shadows across the empty sidewalks, and the occasional raccoon scurrying across the road provided the only signs of life. The mayor's mind wandered to tomorrow's agenda. A morning meeting with local business owners about revitalizing the downtown area followed by. His train of thought was interrupted by the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought the police car would pass by, probably responding to some emergency call. But the cruiser stayed right behind him, lights blazing. Confused, he checked his speedometer. He was actually going 5 miles under the limit. Years of experience had taught him to always drive carefully, especially at night. Following the well-practiced routine that his parents had drilled into him since his teenage years, he turned on his interior lights, kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, and slowly pulled over to the right side of Oak Street, right in front of the old Peterson house with its distinctive white picket fence. His heart rate quickened, not from fear exactly, but from the familiar tension that came with these situations. Even as mayor, even in a suit and tie, even in his father's Mercedes, some things didn't change. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of his position, his rights, and most importantly, his responsibility to handle whatever came next with the same grace and dignity that had carried him to the mayor's office. Through his side mirror, he watched the police officer emerge from the patrol car. The officer's hand was already resting on his holster, a detail that didn't escape the mayor's notice. In the quiet of the night, the sound of boots on pavement seemed unnaturally loud, each step building tension in the otherwise peaceful suburban scene. Little did either of them know that this routine traffic stop was about to become a pivotal moment in Riverdale's history, one that would challenge assumptions, change lives, and ultimately transform an entire community's understanding of justice, dignity, and the power of choosing wisdom over anger. The police officer had been with the Riverdale Police Department for over a decade. Tonight was supposed to be a routine patrol, just like any other night. Earlier, there had been a report about a suspicious black Mercedes in the area, something about a car matching that description being involved in some incident 2 towns over. At least, that's what he would later claim in his report. The truth was more complicated. The officer had been having a rough week. His performance review hadn't gone well, with his supervisor noting several complaints about his aggressive approach to routine stops. His marriage wasn't doing any better, and the strain was showing in his work. But none of these personal struggles justified what was about to unfold. As he approached the Mercedes, his flashlight beam swept across the car's spotless black paint. The vehicle was clearly well maintained, with pristine wheels and perfectly tinted windows that were probably right at the legal limit. This wasn't the kind of car typically involved in the crimes he dealt with, but something about it, or rather, someone inside it, had triggered his suspicions. "Driver, keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice carrying the edge of authority he perfected over years of traffic stops. The interior light was already on, showing the driver's hands placed carefully at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. This should have been his first clue that this wasn't going to be the kind of stop he'd anticipated. Through the window, he could see a man in an expensive suit, his tie still perfectly knotted despite the late hour. But the officer's brain seemed to filter out these details, focusing instead on what his biases wanted him to see. License and registration, he demanded, his hand still resting on his holster, even though the driver's calm compliance gave him no reason for such caution. "Officer, I want to comply with your request, but I'd like to explain something first," the driver began, his voice steady and measured. "I'm the May." "I didn't ask for explanations," the officer cut him off, his voice rising. "License and registration now." The sudden aggression in his tone caught the attention of a couple walking their dog across the street. They slowed their pace, the woman already pulling out her phone. The mayor slowly reached for his wallet, narrating his movements just as his father had taught him years ago. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my inner jacket pocket," he said clearly, each word deliberate and calm. But even this textbook compliance seemed to agitate the officer further. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered, taking a step back and widening his stance. By now, more lights were coming on in the nearby houses. Curtains twitched as curious neighbors peered out at the scene unfolding under the streetlights. The mayor took another deep breath. In his 3 months as mayor, he'd dealt with budget crises, infrastructure emergencies, and political rivalries. But this moment, this simple traffic stop, was testing his composure in ways that no city council meeting ever had. As he carefully opened his car door, he could hear more sirens in the distance. Someone, probably one of the watching neighbors, had called for backup. The irony wasn't lost on him. Backup was indeed needed, but not for the reasons anyone might have assumed. The chilly night air hit him as he stepped onto the pavement, his polished dress shoes clicking against the asphalt. More phones were recording now, their small red lights glowing like fireflies in the darkness. The officer's body camera was recording too, capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming a pivotal incident in both their lives. Standing there under the harsh glare of police lights, the mayor remained outwardly calm, even as his mind raced through the implications of what was happening. He wasn't just experiencing this as an individual anymore. He was living it as a leader whose response would set the tone for his entire community's reaction to what was unfolding. Little did the officer know that his next actions would not only change the course of his own career, but would spark a conversation that would ripple through police departments across the country. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, like a routine traffic stop on a quiet suburban street that was about to become anything but routine. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Standing on the sidewalk, the mayor could feel the rough texture of the cement under his dress shoes, so different from the plushed carpeting of his office where he'd been just an hour ago. The police lights painted everything in alternating flashes of red and blue, creating strange shadows that danced across the faces of the growing crowd of onlookers. "Turn around, hands against the vehicle," the officer commanded, his voice carrying a hint of something that sounded almost like nervousness beneath the aggressive tone. The mayor complied, the cold metal of his car pressing against his palms. His tie brushed against the pristine black paint, the same car he'd driven to his swearing-in ceremony just 3 months ago. "Officer," he began again, keeping his voice steady and professional, "I need to inform you that I'm the May." "I said quiet." The officer snapped, cutting him off again. The mayor could hear the crunch of gravel under the officer's boots as he moved closer. More car doors were slamming in the distance, backup arriving, no doubt. The neighbors who had been watching from their windows were now gathering on their front lawns, many holding up phones to record the scene. A young couple who lived across the street had their phone lights on, streaming the entire incident. The wife was speaking rapidly into her phone, probably calling the police department directly. The husband stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head in disbelief. They'd attended the mayor's community outreach meeting just last week. The sound of running feet approached, and a second officer arrived on the scene. She took in the situation with wide eyes, her hand dropping from her holster as recognition dawned on her face. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying a note of alarm, "that's the May." But the first officer wasn't listening. He was too focused on maintaining control of what he still saw as a suspicious situation. "I'm going to check your ID now," he announced, reaching for the wallet the mayor had placed on the car's roof as instructed. The leather wallet, a gift from his daughter last Father's Day, lay there like a silent witness to the unfolding scene. More patrol cars were arriving now, their lights turning the quiet suburban street into something resembling a concert light show. An elderly woman in a bathrobe stood on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, apparently talking to someone about what she was witnessing. "You won't believe what's happening to our mayor right now," her voice carried clearly through the night air. Finally, the first officer opened the wallet. His movements, which had been sharp and certain, suddenly became slower, more hesitant. The mayor's official ID stared back at him, along with a gold-embossed business card that clearly stated Office of the Mayor, City of Riverdale. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the crickets seemed to have stopped chirping to watch what would happen next. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, looking between her colleague and the mayor. The growing crowd of neighbors murmured among themselves, their phones still recording every moment. But the first officer, instead of acknowledging his mistake, seemed to dig in deeper. "We've had reports of people impersonating officials," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "We'll need to verify this." The mayor remained calm, though the absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him. Just hours ago, he'd been signing documents that would determine this very officer's department budget for the next fiscal year. Now he was being treated like a common criminal, all because, well, they all knew why. More senior officers were arriving now, their radios crackling with confused chatter. The news was spreading quickly through the department channels. Someone in the crowd was already on the phone with a local news station. This incident, which had started as a simple traffic stop, was rapidly evolving into something much bigger. The whole scene had taken on an almost surreal quality. The mayor of Riverdale, still in his suit from a budget meeting, standing spread-eagled against his own car, while a crowd of his constituents watched in horror. But even in this moment, his mind was already working on how to turn this painful incident into something productive for his community. Because that's what leaders do. They take difficult moments and transform them into opportunities for change. And as he stood there, watching the red and blue lights paint patterns on his car's polished surface, he knew this night would become a turning point for Riverdale. The only question was, would it tear the community apart, or would it bring them together in ways they never expected? The arrival of the rookie officer changed everything. Fresh out of the academy, she'd attended every city council meeting since joining the force, partly because she believed in community policing, and partly because she wanted to understand how city politics affected her job. The moment she stepped out of her patrol car, she recognized the man standing against the Mercedes. Just yesterday, she'd watched him give a speech about improving police-community relations. Now here he was, being treated like a suspect. Her stomach dropped as she realized the magnitude of what was unfolding before her. "Wait," she called out, her voice carrying across the scene. "That's our mayor." The words hung in the air like frost on a winter morning. Several of the other responding officers froze in their tracks, recognition dawning on their faces. They'd all seen him at department meetings, discussing budgets and community initiatives. But the first officer, perhaps too deep in his mistake to back down, continued his aggressive stance. "We need to verify these credentials," he insisted, though his voice had lost its earlier authority. His hands were slightly shaking as he held the mayor's ID, the gold city seal catching the flash of police lights. The rookie officer stepped closer, her body camera recording everything. She'd learned about moments like this in training, when you have to stand up to a superior officer who's making a mistake. But textbook scenarios hadn't prepared her for the reality of this situation. "Sir," she addressed her fellow officer, choosing her words carefully, "I can personally verify his identity. I was at City Hall this morning when he was meeting with the police commission." Her voice was steady, professional, but there was an unmistakable note of urgency in it. More patrol cars were arriving, their headlights illuminating the scene like a stage. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, their phones recording every moment. Someone had started a live stream, and comments were pouring in from across the city. The incident was no longer just a local matter, it was becoming a real-time example of everything wrong with profiling. An older officer, a sergeant with 20 years on the force, stepped forward. He'd worked security at the mayor's inauguration and had seen him almost weekly since then. The look on his face spoke volumes. This was exactly the kind of incident they'd been working to prevent. "Let's take those cuffs off," the sergeant said quietly to the first officer. It wasn't a suggestion. The mayor remained silent as the handcuffs were removed, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he'd just endured. The metal cuffs had left slight marks on his wrists, temporary reminders of a permanent problem. The rookie officer noticed how the mayor maintained his composure even as the cuffs were being removed. There was something powerful about his calm demeanor, something that spoke of years of experience dealing with similar situations, even before he became mayor. The first officer now stood awkwardly, his earlier confidence replaced by the slow realization of what he'd done. His body camera was still recording, documenting every moment of his mistake. Tomorrow, this footage would be reviewed by his superiors, but tonight, he had to face the immediate consequences of his actions. In the crowd, people were making phone calls. Some were contacting local news stations. Others were calling city council members. A few were even trying to reach civil rights organizations. The quiet suburban street had become ground zero for a conversation the city had been avoiding for years. The rookie officer watched as the mayor straightened his tie and brushed off his suit jacket, simple actions that somehow carried immense dignity. She saw how he glanced at the growing crowd, not with anger or resentment, but with the thoughtful expression of a leader already considering how to handle this situation. The air was charged with tension, but also with possibility. Everyone present could sense that this moment would change things. The question was, how would the mayor respond? Would he call for the officer's badge? Demand an investigation? File a lawsuit? His next actions would set the tone for the entire city's response. The first officer cleared his throat, perhaps preparing to offer an excuse or an apology. But before he could speak, something unexpected happened. The mayor raised his hand, silencing not just the officer, but the murmuring crowd as well. What he would say next would surprise everyone present and set in motion a chain of events that would transform their community in ways no one could have predicted. The police chief's arrival changed the atmosphere instantly. His unmarked car pulled up silently, lights off, a stark contrast to the flash of red and blue that had turned the suburban street into an impromptu light show. He stepped out, tablet in hand, his face illuminated by its blue glow as he reviewed the footage that was already being uploaded from the officer's body cameras. The crowd parted as he walked through, his expression growing more concerned with each step. 25 years on the force had taught him to read situations quickly, but this one was unprecedented. His best traffic officer had just detained the city's mayor in what was quickly becoming a viral incident. The footage playing on his tablet told a clear story. He watched the initial stop, the escalation, the moment of recognition, all captured in high definition. Each frame revealed what could have been done differently, each moment a lesson in what needed to change. The chief looked up from the tablet to find everyone watching him, the gathered officers, the neighbors with their phones still recording, and the mayor himself, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the entire ordeal. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. But instead of immediately taking control of the situation, the chief did something unexpected. He walked over to the mayor and asked quietly, "Sir, what would you like to see happen here?" The question caught everyone off guard. Usually, in situations like this, department higher-ups would jump into damage control mode. They'd rush to issue apologies, promise investigations, and try to minimize publicity. But the chief seemed to understand that this moment called for something different. The mayor studied the chief's face for a long moment. Around them, the crowd had gone quiet, straining to hear what would happen next. Even the crickets seemed to be holding their breath. The first officer stood awkwardly to the side, his earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. "Chief," the mayor began, his voice clear and measured, "what happened here tonight isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been pulled over and felt that flash of fear, wondering if this stop might be their last. It's about every parent who's had to teach their children exactly how to behave during a traffic stop, not just to be polite, but to stay alive." He paused, looking around at the gathered crowd. Some were nodding in recognition. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps realizing for the first time what their neighbors lived with every day. The rookie officer who had recognized him was taking notes, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. "But it's also about our officers," the mayor continued, surprising everyone again. "It's about the training they receive, the pressures they face, and the biases they might not even realize they carry. This isn't about pointing fingers, it's about fixing a system that's not working for anyone. The chief's tablet had gone dark, but no one noticed. All eyes were on the mayor as he laid out his vision. Instead of calls for punishment or resignation, he spoke about opportunity. Instead of demands for justice, he talked about healing. "I propose we use this incident," the mayor said, his voice gaining strength, "not as a weapon to divide us, but as a tool to bring us together. I want body camera footage from tonight used in training sessions. I want community meetings where people can share their experiences openly. And I want the officer involved to be part of this process, not pushed aside or made into a scapegoat." The first officer's head snapped up at this, surprise clear on his face. He had expected anger, demands for his badge, maybe even legal action. Instead, the mayor was offering him a chance to be part of the solution. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sound of distant sirens, a reminder of the ongoing work of law enforcement in their city. But here, on this suburban street that had become an unlikely stage for change, something remarkable was taking shape. The chief looked down at his tablet again, then back at the mayor. In his quarter-century of police work, he'd seen countless incidents escalate into bitter legal battles and community divisions. But this was different. This was an opportunity to do something that could reach far beyond their city limits. As he stood there, considering the mayor's words, the chief realized that sometimes the best leadership doesn't come from enforcing authority, but from having the wisdom to step back and let transformation take its natural course. The morning after the incident, the mayor's office was flooded with calls. News vans lined the street outside City Hall, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal sunflowers. Social media was buzzing with video clips from the previous night, each one generating thousands of comments and shares. The easy path would have been to hold a press conference, demand the officer's resignation, and file a lawsuit. That's what everyone expected. That's what the crowd of reporters camping outside his office was waiting for. But the mayor had spent a sleepless night thinking about a different approach. Instead of meeting with reporters, he scheduled a private meeting. The conference room on the third floor of City Hall had just 4 people that morning: the mayor, the police chief, the officer from the incident, and a community relations expert who'd worked with the city for years. The officer sat stiffly in his chair, his uniform perfectly pressed, but his face showed the strain of a sleepless night. He'd already written his resignation letter, it sat folded in his pocket, waiting, but the mayor started the meeting with something unexpected. "Tell me about your training," he said to the officer. "Tell me what went through your mind last night." "I don't want excuses, I want understanding." His voice was firm but not angry, curious rather than accusatory. For the next hour, they talked, really talked. The officer spoke about the pressure of the job, the split-second decisions, the fear that lived in the back of his mind during every traffic stop. The mayor shared his own experiences of being profiled, not just that night, but throughout his life. As they talked, an idea began to take shape. Instead of punishment, they would focus on prevention. Instead of division, they would aim for understanding. The mayor pulled out a blank piece of paper and started writing. First on the list, a complete overhaul of the police department's training program. Not just a few added hours of bias training, but a fundamental rethinking of how officers interact with the community. The officer who'd stopped him would help develop the new program, sharing his experience as a teaching tool. Second, regular community dialogue sessions. Not the usual town halls where people just complained and nothing changed, but structured conversations between officers and residents. They would share meals together, talk about their fears and hopes, and work on solutions as equals. Third, a citizen oversight committee with real power, not just to review complaints, but to help shape department policy. The committee would include people from all parts of the community: teachers, business owners, young people, seniors. Everyone would have a voice. The police chief watched as the list grew longer. He'd been worried about budget cuts after this incident. Instead, the mayor was proposing to invest more in the department, but with clear expectations for change. The community relations expert took notes, occasionally offering suggestions. She'd seen other cities try similar programs, but usually only after protests or lawsuits forced their hand. This proactive approach was different. As the morning turned to afternoon, more details emerged. They would need specialized trainers, community facilitators, data analysts to track progress. The officer, who had started the meeting expecting to lose his job, found himself assigned to lead several key initiatives. But why? He finally asked the mayor. After what happened, why trust me with this? The mayor looked at him thoughtfully. Because you're the perfect person to help create change. You've lived both sides of this story now. You know what it's like to let assumptions guide your actions, and you know what it's like to face the consequences. That makes you valuable. Outside the conference room, the world was waiting for a dramatic response: firings, protests, lawsuits. Instead, they were quietly building something revolutionary. It wouldn't make headlines like a lawsuit would. It wouldn't satisfy those calling for immediate action. But it had the potential to create lasting change. By late afternoon, they had a complete draft of the initiative. The officer's resignation letter remained in his pocket, unopened. Instead of ending his career, this would be the day he started making a real difference in his community. As they wrapped up the meeting, the mayor looked around the room. "This won't be easy," he said. "Some people will say we're not doing enough. Others will say we're doing too much. But easy solutions aren't what we need right now. We need real change, and real change takes time, commitment, and courage." 6 months passed like a blur of meetings, training sessions, and community gatherings. The local coffee shop had become an unofficial headquarters for the new Police Community Partnership Program. On this particular morning, the officer who'd made that fateful traffic stop sat at a corner table reviewing the latest feedback from their training sessions. The door chimed as the mayor walked in, ordering his usual black coffee before joining the officer. These informal meetings had become a regular occurrence, a way to check in on progress without the formality of City Hall. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the changes 6 months could bring. "Remember when you tried to arrest me?" the mayor said with a slight smile, breaking the ice. The officer shook his head, able to laugh about it now, though the memory still made him uncomfortable. "I never thought that night would lead to this," he admitted, gesturing at the stack of papers before him. Those papers told quite a story. Complaint rates had dropped by 40% since implementing their new training program. Community participation in police events had tripled. Other cities were starting to take notice, sending representatives to learn about what they dubbed the Riverdale model. But the real changes weren't just in the statistics. They were in the small moments that happened every day. Like yesterday, when a young officer handled a tense traffic stop with such skill and empathy that the driver ended up thanking her. Or last week, when a community meeting turned from angry accusations into productive dialogue about neighborhood safety. The officer who'd stopped the mayor had become something of a specialist in teaching others about unconscious bias. He shared his story openly, using his mistake as a teaching tool. "I thought I was one of the good ones," he'd tell his classes. "But good intentions aren't enough if we don't understand our own biases." The local high school had started a youth police dialogue program, bringing teenagers and officers together for honest conversations about their experiences and fears. These sessions often got emotional, but that was part of the healing process. Young people who once saw police as threats were beginning to see them as human beings. Officers who had viewed certain neighborhoods with suspicion were learning to see the community's strength and resilience. Not everything had been smooth sailing. Some officers resisted the changes at first, seeing them as an attack on traditional policing. A few community members demanded more dramatic reforms. But the steady, consistent approach began to win over even the skeptics. The mayor's inbox still held emails from other cities asking how they'd managed to turn a potential crisis into an opportunity for growth. The answer wasn't simple. It required commitment from everyone involved, from the highest-ranking official to the newest recruit. The coffee shop had filled up around them as they talked. A mix of uniforms and civilian clothes, people from all parts of the community sharing space comfortably. This itself was a small victory. 6 months ago, such casual interaction between police and residents would have been rare. "Chief's retiring next month," the officer mentioned, stirring his coffee. "Word is they're considering me for a leadership position in the training division." He said it casually, but there was pride in his voice. From nearly losing his badge to helping reshape the department, it had been quite a journey. The mayor nodded, remembering the night that could have torn their community apart. Instead, it had become the catalyst for bringing people together. Real change, they'd learned, doesn't come from dramatic gestures or quick fixes. It comes from the daily work of building trust, one conversation at a time. As they wrapped up their meeting, a group of teenage students entered the coffee shop, part of the Youth Dialogue program. They waved to the officer, calling him by name. 6 months ago, those same young people might have crossed the street to avoid a police officer. Now they were grabbing coffee together before their morning session. Outside, the city was waking up to another day. Traffic moved steadily down Main Street, people hurried to work, and life went on as usual. But something fundamental had shifted in Riverdale. A traffic stop that could have been just another sad headline had instead become the starting point for real transformation. The mayor stood to leave, his schedule packed with meetings about expanding the program to neighboring cities. "You know," he said to the officer, "sometimes the worst moments in our lives end up leading us exactly where we need to be." The officer watched him go, thinking about how close he'd come to throwing away his career that night. Instead, he'd found his true calling, helping other officers avoid the mistakes he'd made and building bridges with the community they served. As morning sunlight filled the coffee shop, it illuminated more than just the busy scene inside. It showed a glimpse of what's possible when people choose understanding over anger, growth over punishment, and hope over fear. Riverdale had become more than just another town grappling with age-old problems. It had become a model for how to solve them. 1 year had passed since that life-changing traffic stop. The local news station was preparing a special report about the changes in Riverdale, and their cameras captured a scene that would have seemed impossible 12 months ago. In the newly renovated community center, police officers and residents sat together in a circle, sharing stories and snacks. The officer who'd made the traffic stop was leading the session, his badge now complemented by a training coordinator pin. His hands, once quick to rest on his holster, now moved expressively as he facilitated the discussion. "When I first joined the force," he told the group, "I thought good policing was about control and authority. Now I know it's about connection and understanding." The room nodded in agreement, including several officers who had once been skeptical of these changes. Outside the community center, kids played basketball with off-duty officers on the newly installed court. Their laughter mixed with the sound of bouncing balls and friendly trash talk. Parents watched from nearby benches, chatting with patrol officers about neighborhood concerns. The mayor's initiative had grown beyond anyone's expectations. The training program they'd developed was now being used in police departments across 3 states. Weekly community dinners had become so popular they had to rotate locations between different neighborhoods to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. But the real success stories were in the small, everyday moments. Like the elderly woman who now felt comfortable enough to wave down a patrol car when she needed help carrying her groceries, or the teenager who joined the Youth Police Academy after hearing the officer share his story of change. The police department itself had transformed. New officers were trained not just in law enforcement, but in community engagement and cultural understanding. Veteran officers went through regular refresher courses, often taught by community members themselves. The us versus them mentality was slowly being replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Crime rates had dropped, not because of aggressive policing, but because the community and police were working together. When incidents did occur, they were handled with a new level of transparency and accountability that built trust rather than eroding it. The officer who'd stopped the mayor had received offers to leave Riverdale, to take his story and experience to bigger cities with bigger budgets, but he chose to stay. "This is where it happened," he explained to a reporter. "This is where I learned that sometimes your biggest mistake can lead to your greatest contribution." The mayor's office had become a hub for police reform advocates from around the country. They came to see how a small city had turned a potential tragedy into a model for positive change. The mayor always made time for these visitors, but he made even more time for local community meetings. In the police academy's new training facility, a framed photo hung on the wall. It showed the scene from that night: the mayor against his car, the officer with his hand on his holster, the gathered crowd with their phones recording. Below it, a simple caption read, "Where change began." But perhaps the most powerful change was in the conversations that didn't happen anymore. Parents no longer felt the need to have the talk with their children about surviving police encounters. Officers no longer approached every traffic stop with their hands hovering near their weapons. The fear that had lived on both sides began to fade. 1 year after a traffic stop nearly tore Riverdale apart, the city had become an example of what's possible when people choose to learn from their mistakes instead of hiding from them. The officer and the mayor still met regularly at the local coffee shop, not as symbols of change, but as partners in maintaining it. As the news crew packed up their equipment, they captured one final shot. The officer and a group of community members walking out of the center together, laughing and talking like old friends. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, a fitting backdrop for a city that had learned to transform its darkest moment into its brightest opportunity.